What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, bringing you some zesty ideological ingredients so that you can brew your own faith. And today on the podcast, we're going to talk world Christianity and its history with Dr. Derek Cooper from Biblical Theological Seminary. We're chatting it up about his recent text, a recent book, one you can get, 20 Questions That Shaped World Christian History. We have a whole good old time. And by the end, you'll even get some tips, some tricks, some little nuggets of wisdom just about how to be a good old nerd. He gives some nerd wisdom at the end. So that's awesome too. Anyway, had a great time talking to Derek. Look forward to that. Get ready. It's going to be awesome. Before we jump in, I want to just tell you a few things. One, Homebrewed Christianity is going to be at Wild Goose Festival in North Carolina in the midst of July, the month of July. And when you go check out about going to Wild Goose Festival and all the amazing things that are going to be there. Use the code GooseFest2016. You'll get 25% off. Yeah. Then later in July, I'm going to be in Vancouver, Canada. I'm going to get to do a Theology Nerd boot camp. I'll be joined by John Cobb and Jay McDaniel. And the next day, I'm going to do a live podcast in Vancouver with some local craft breweries bringing some tasty treats. And I'm going to get to talk to Sally McFay. Yeah, John, Jay, and Trevor, some amazing people up in Canada. Canadian deacons will be there. So just head on over to homebrewedchristianity.com and you can get your clicky clicks and your linky links. And join me at the Goose or in Canada. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is if you're like in part of a pub group or like a church reading group or book group and you read Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, let me know the one I wrote. Let me know. I've recently started Skyping in and doing some Q&A with groups that are reading the book, and it's been amazing. A blast. A ton of fun. So, if you're like a minister or small group leader and you pick books, you could score double cool points, maybe, if the author Skypes in and talks to you after you read it. And I have answered questions about all sorts of stuff. Like I told someone, I said, look, I will answer every question somehow related to Jesus. And I was tested. But don't try me. I can do it. Anyway, if you're going to do that, just hit me up. Because I'm excited. And just know that very soon you're going to be getting the next book in the Homebrewed Christianity series, the Homebrewed Guide to the End. Theology for Those That Have Been Left Behind by Jeffrey C. Pugh. It's coming out soon. You can pre-order it on Amazon. You can pre-order it on the Homebrewed site. It's going to be awesome. But you know what else is awesome? Free stuff. So let's say you're saying to yourself, Trip, I love the podcast, but I have more hours while I'm stuck in traffic that I want to nerd out with my geek out. And what I would really, really like is like a 4-session workshop introduction to radical theology. Could you do that for me, Trip? And could you arrange for Jack Caputo, Peter Rollins, and Barry Taylor to all be involved? And I will just say, yes, I can. Because it happened at the Hatchery, the place I teach school, as part of the Homebrewed pregame to Unfolding Theology event this year, and I've got it all edited up and ready to deliver to you for the grand total of 0. So if you text the number 44222, 44222, no spaces in this, get radical, then you're going to get delivered to you via the email that you tell them to send it to. And by them, I mean whoever it is in the cloud that sends treats for you sending the email for texting and such. You're going to get an email. And then in it, there's going to be a little linky link. You'll click it and boom, a folder will appear on your computer with all 4 sessions. And you can get your radical theology on. So text 44222. Text it. Say get radical. No space. And get it for frizzies. Now, heads up, coming up this summer, we're going to do a number of fun interactive webinars on June 15th, coming up soon. Jorg, Rosemary, Rieger, going to join a webinar and talk about the relationship of labor and faith and activism and theology that matters and does stuff connected to matter. So if you want to do that, sign up June 15th, 11 a.m. on the West Coast, 1 a.m., 1 p.m. on the East Coast. On the 20th of July, I'm going to be doing one on public theology. Actually, Facebook to the pulpit during election year. Yep. And Kyle's going to join me. Kyle Roberts, public theology professor, United Theological Seminary. We're going to talk about what in the world you do to be a public theologian, taking stands and such, being prophetic and such, but doing it with class, sophistication, and nerdy-like things, helping to equip church leaders to think about it. Facebook to the pulpit, and that's July 20th. And just head to homebrewchristianity.com. You can sign up for all of them. There are little Facebook pages for them, like event pages on the Homebrewed Facebook page. And there, just make sure you click and sign up. Then you'll get an email the day of with an invitation into the webinar room. And if you sign up and can't make it, then you'll get an email from having signed up with the replay and all that kind of stuff. There you go. So I'm talking about Wild Goose, Canada. I'll Skype into your group, giving you free stuff, texting Get Radical to 44222. Then on the 15th of June, webinar with the Riegers, talking about labor, theology, action, connecting them dots. And then the 20th of July, Facebook to the pulpit, election year theologizing. There you have it. All those goods, and that is just what I'm trying to do here at Homebrewed, is bring you the ingredients. I want you to brew your own faith. I want you to keep it zesty. And if you are like, this is just, I don't know what to do, Trip. There's just too many options here. Then just go to the website. You can find out links about all of it, and you'll find links to Derek Cooper's books, because you're about to hear him talk about global Christianity and the history of global world Christianity, and why you need to even add that moniker in there. Why is it not just church history? We're going to talk about it. All right? So buckle them theological safety belts. Buckle them, because here it comes. Choo choo. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and today Derek Cooper is in the house, and he's talking about a book. You would have thought we were going to talk about the NBA playoffs, but no, we're talking about a book, and he has a brand new one out from Fortress Press, part of the Theology for the People series, called 20 Questions That Shaped World Christian History. Derek's a professor out in Philadelphia at the Biblical Theological Seminary, so that means he likes the Bible and church history at the same time. And apparently likes the world, which is not always trendy with Christians. So now we're going to have to figure all this out. So, Derek, what's up? What's up with this new book?
Yeah, this is a book that I was excited to write because I am a church historian, and I am described as a world Christian historian. So that's my title, and I'll be happy to talk more about the difference between world Christian history and church history. But essentially, I'm just always trying to figure out what's the best way to talk about church history with Christians, because it's just simply a topic that a lot of people aren't really excited about. But I'm always saying, hey, this is a gold mine. Everything you want to know, it's here if you could just connect with it.
So you said that your family's from Texas. You'd been there a long time. What part of the church are you from, and how does a Texan get interested in history that goes before the Alamo?
Yeah. My mom in East Texas, where I was born and raised, has a picture in her kitchen of the Alamo. And of course, the words, remember the Alamo. So yeah, I get it honestly from being a 6th generation Texan. I don't know exactly where I got my interest in history was. There's a lot of interesting history in Texas, but I think over the years, as I was reading the Bible, I was more kind of a Bible person, and I enjoyed reading the Bible and learning about it. But I just felt like, I want to know how these people actually lived out this stuff, because in the Bible, you get good stories of what God is up to with individual communities, but we don't get to see how much it's actually lived out. So I'm thinking to myself, how can I go about exploring how people live this out in Nigeria, how they lived it out in France, how they lived it out in Kazakhstan. So church history gives me a much bigger plate to work with, which is why I'm excited about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us what's going on with world Christian history. The world part, like, is that just there to remind you that everyone in the world should be Christians and God's saving them, or what's that mean?
Yeah, so world Christian history is more of a recent discipline within church history. And the problem with church history and like church history books and the way that church history has been taught for so long is it pretty much just assumes that in the very beginning, you have in the first century, the Christians went to Rome, and from there, Christianity hung out in the western parts of Europe for 1,500 years, and then eventually went to the United States, and then it's been hanging out with the United States for the past 500 years. So it really exclusively looks at Christianity in the West. And there's all kinds of problems with that, but the major one is that's just not how early Christianity was, and that's not how Christianity is supposed to be. So world Christianity or world Christian history takes seriously that church history has always been a worldwide religion, and it should always be a worldwide religion. So we give ample coverage. Basically, we share coverage of Europe with Africa, with Asia, with Latin America, and so forth.
So a lot of people, especially in America, because of, I don't know, frontier anti-intellectualism or the separation of church and state, and so the academy has a more distant relationship with the church. But there are a lot of denominations who part of their identity in America is like, oh, we're like the one legit Christian. And so my family are Baptist church planters, and I have some aunts and uncles out in Arkansas. You may have some of these in Texas, and they're primitive Baptists, but they're pretty sure there probably weren't real Christians after John the Baptist until Baptists. And I know I work at a school that's connected to the Disciples of Christ, and the Stone Campbellite movement has similar feelings. I know some Free Methodists that Free Methodists is code for the other ones aren't real Christians. So as a church historian, like, we have a hard time in America often recognizing just the diversity of Western church history that leads to America, let alone the huge diversity of Christianity. What are kind of those opening frameworks or steps that you invite students into?
Yeah, I basically will start off with a statistic that's pretty arresting, and that is that within Protestant Christianity alone, there are about 50,000 different denominations.
Well, how many of them are Christian?
Every one of them.
Oh, okay.
Every one of them. They're all, and they're just Protestant denominations. So we're not even talking about all the different Catholic and Orthodox traditions. So I start off with that statistic. So we have to recognize there's 50,000 different Protestant denominations, and they each think that they really are more right than the other. And some of them think that they're the only ones who are right and everybody else is totally wrong. And so once we do that, it kind of helps people realize, whoa, this is serious here. And then I like to start with Scripture and look at different passages in the Bible and say, okay, how do you go about interpreting this passage? And then I'll go to another region of the world and say, well, you know what? At this time, this is how they interpreted this passage. Tell me why their interpretation is wrong and your interpretation is right. Mm-hmm. And so that just kind of starts a conversation to let us recognize it's not that the Bible is necessarily unclear. It's just that people come to the Bible with all different types of backgrounds and experiences and limitations and biases and prejudice and so forth. And so when they read the Bible, they interpret it a little differently. So it's a lot harder to read the Bible than we think, is what I essentially say.
Well, I remember, I'm trying to remember when it was. I think it was freshman or sophomore year in undergrad when I went to a Baptist school, and at Baptist schools, you're cool by out-Jesusing each other. I know for in California, people just don't get this. But if you go to a Baptist school in North Carolina, so in my chance to just out-Christian all my other Christian campus minister leaders, I was like, they're all doing the read the Bible in a year thing. And I'm like, bump that in a semester. What's up? On top of doing all my work for the religion classes. And I read all the passages that were assigned in class separately devotionally because, using your brain and thinking critically is not how you engage Scripture with the Holy Spirit. So I remember getting done with it and then thinking, oh my goodness, there's actually the Trinity's not in the Bible. And there's not real good clarity on like the incarnation either. And so church history is as much a continuation of these narratives and conversations and questions that we ask rather than something that gets settled, which like in thinking of that, one of the reasons I really like the book is you tell history not as kind of like a series of conclusions, but questions. There are questions of times and periods and cultures, and then there are like the big questions that Christians kind of always ask. Like part of being a Christian is, why in the world is my experience of God mediated by Jesus? Now, there's a million answers, but you don't find Christians that don't ask that question.
Yeah.
So tell me what's in the question as the framing device of history.
Yeah, I think for us as Christians, we can go back and look at Jesus, and we see Jesus was the great question asker. And if you look at the questions he asked, they're so provocative, they're so precise, they're really contextual, so they only make sense within his culture. But Jesus, he was so good at asking questions. And so I'm thinking of church history as essentially it's just what Christians are doing as they are addressing different issues. And it starts with a question like, how do we deal with that? And so Jesus basically sets it up for us. And then in church history, I talk about in the introduction to the book, if we compare Christianity to a sentence or something, it's not ended with an exclamation point. It's really not ended with a period. It's ended with a question. And Christians disagree on questions, but when they have the same questions, they disagree on the answers to that. So in one of the chapters, you talked about these early disputes on, is Jesus human? Is he divine? What is he? Well, in the 400s, this is what the Christians were just talking about left and right. They didn't come to any agreement together. You have different traditions. Some groups say this, some groups say that. And the question's still out there for people to answer today.
Yeah, I think the other insight around questions is pedagogical in the sense that how many Christians do we know that don't know some really sweet stories from church history or don't know? It's like not knowing you have an extended family packed full of like crazy uncles and really cool aunts, right? So, but for some reason, if you discover more of your family history, you're like, oh, this is awesome. And you can at the same time think you're like great uncle who's a racist POS and was a Confederate soldier is a scumbag for that. But then learn about how he treated his family and came over to the United States. You'd be like, that's cool. And then you read their like devotional stuff and you're like, oh my God, they're like more than 5-point Calvinists. This is scary. Like I can do all that. And you're totally, it makes sense to do that as your family member. You're like, there's dignity here. There's some disasters. There's things to learn. But somehow church history, even for Christians, but in culture in general, is read as things that are stupid to think about, really embarrassing mistakes, which makes all religion and Jesus look horrible, and look at the ignoramuses. Like we have not learned the beauty of letting people exist in their own time and situation. Just like I hope in 100 years, people are like, if for some reason they find this on the internet, look, Tripp and Derek, they're ridiculous. How 2016 is that BS? They meant well. They must like Jesus, but we're going to have blind spots from our situation. So like, where do you think this comes from that the church just, even the church, but culture as well, has this weird relationship with its history?
Yeah, you hit on right with my last book with Fortress Press. It's a little thin book. It was a fun book to write. It's called Exploring Church History. And it's not a very exciting title, but I think the content's really good. But I talk about this like church history. It's like a family reunion when you go back and look at church history. So you go to a family reunion and you've got the weird uncle over there doing things, like, what is this guy up to? And then you've got some other people that you like to hang out with. But you've got all these people out there, and they've got these amazing stories. Some of them are really horrible stories. Some of them are inspiring stories. But I think at the end of the day, history is kind of thrown under the bus because I just feel like history professors have not done a good job stewarding history, and they focus so much on dates and on individuals, and they have forgotten all of the fascinating stories that are wrapped up in these people's lives. So I always tell my students, history is the discipline before which all other disciplines bow, because everything's happened in history. If we just take the time to go and to learn more, we'll see that church history is our best friend because everything has already happened. All the stories are there for us to learn from, to get inspiration from, if we just take the time to do it.
Yeah, the questions that I think are shaping our own day and kind of contemporary American church questions are even different than the questions that are shaping the church in Africa, or the ones in North America are different than the ones in Europe. So when you're going through church history, at what point do you start to see a multiplicity of church centers that then get dominated by different questions?
Yeah, I think like church history or history in general is kind of, like there's something called big history, which goes back all the way to the beginning of time. And it's like looking at trends. And so if you imagine like when solar systems come into being, they're like attract, or like a planet comes into being, it attracts smaller planets like in its orbit. Mm-hmm. And so we see the same thing in church history. There's major centers. And so depending on which time period we're looking at, we can think of Constantinople, which is in Istanbul today, becomes a center for Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And the different questions that you see Christians in Bulgaria wrestling with, or Christians in Romania, Christians in Turkey, Christians in Russia, are all kind of similar because they have this cluster, of Orthodox Christianity that's like giving them the questions to ask, or at least the way to think about framing those questions. So you definitely see these different centers, and it just depends on which time period you're at. But it's never that all of them are equal. There's like big centers that are kind of sucking in all of the other smaller ones, or kind of absorbing them. So yeah, you see these series of questions that are asked again and again. Mm-hmm.
And I remember, I can't remember his name. What's Bauer, FC Bauer? Is that it?
Yeah, the German historian.
Yeah, in talking about like in the early church, how the things that got canonized, right, were predominantly popular in different geographic regions that are showing different conclusions emerging to the first big question in the book: what's the relationship between Christianity and Judaism? And why I think like it's helpful to see as Christians that there's actually a multiplicity of answers to that question in our own canon, right? Like that question, what's the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, is not a settled one when you read the New Testament. Paul, Matthew, Mark, and John all have different answers, and they're contrasting, and yet they're all in our canon. So what's that? How do you like introduce, especially biblical seminary? Usually the word biblical means like monotoned one answer. Like when I hear the word biblical or historic Christianity, I hear, normally you think, oh, the logic of the one is about to come in, erase difference, enhance sameness, and do some significant editing so we're all on the same page. Yeah. But yet in biblical witness, from the very beginning, we have a multiplicity of expressions.
Yeah, we do. And there's a book written by John Franke, who used to teach at biblical seminary for several years. It was called Manifold Witness, the Plurality of Truth. And he kind of addresses that topic. But yeah, as you mentioned, this is a biblical seminary that I teach at. People in the Protestant tradition, especially if they're in the evangelical tradition, you have to start with Scripture. And if you can't convince them on Scripture, then you're never going to convince them anything else. So what I like to do is I can just look at the book of James and then look at Galatians, and you see you have two different authors here who were working with the same passage, something like Genesis chapter 15, where they're talking about Abraham and his faith and what exactly made him right in God's eyes. Well, Paul says one thing, and then the author of the book of James says something completely different. And the funny thing is they both use the exact same passage in Genesis 15 as a way to justify their own points. So it's really interesting to see in Scripture itself, we have this diversity of views. And if we see that in Scripture already, then we can expect church history is only going to continue that and make it even louder and more diverse.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think there's a hermeneutical and political decision made when the church rejects like Tatian and the Harmony Gospels for canonizing like super Jewish Matthew, sketchy resurrection Mark that begins at baptism, to Logos Christology, I walk around saying I am John, to I'm so Gentile you can't help it Luke, right? Like when you're like, no, please don't line everything up correctly. We would hate for someone to have faith in the text and not the encounter that gets itself done in it. But that desire, right, for certainty, finality, and things, and you kind of point out in the book, like that type of question is a uniquely Enlightenment question. Yeah, right? Like that would not have been the framing question for how stuff's getting in canon. It's just now we're sitting there going, hey, maybe it'd be really helpful if they'd work this out. And if Paul had annotated Romans so that we knew where the Roman road was and when he was just filling in that would have been helpful as well. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you know, we in the Protestant world, in the Western world, we want answers to our questions, and we want them precisely and we want them definitively. But that's just not the way church history works. And that's part of the reason why I think it's so beneficial is I think instead of getting the answers to our questions, we need to work on asking better questions. And a lot of those questions just simply aren't going to allow us to have definitive answers, because you see church history corrects itself. So going back to the Civil War, this is an area that I teach on, and I talk about just a little in the book, but the idea of slavery, for instance, just 150 years ago in our country, and you see Christian pastors, Christian theologians, Christian seminary presidents, and so forth, who use the Bible to justify their actions for slavery, and they are so confident that they're right. And yet, as we read those today, we read them in horror, thinking they actually use this passage to justify this, and we have no idea where they're coming from. But yeah, as you mentioned, 150 years from now, people are going to be judging us based on our limited views of Scripture and theology. So when you kind of introduce, and you can tell some of the questions you pick, I think, are ones that are so historical for that time, and other ones are like, if your friend who's totally not interested in what you do is sitting down with you and you're like, oh, okay, I'll have another glass of wine. Tell me something, you historian, entertain me. You have a nice Cabernet here, so I'll listen while I sip it. You say something to me. Some of them are selected just to go like, if I have to get in my nerdiness for a minute, let me make sure I fit a couple questions in here on Islam and write them historically just to set up for you never saying something really stupid on your Facebook feed. So can you tell us, like, what, as a historian, what are the topics from church history that regularly on your Facebook feed you like look at your friend? Oh my God, really? You should have had me for church history, or you're messaging former students going, yes, I don't know. You should read your notes again. Have you thought about having some adult education at your congregation? I could subtly in it correct you. Like, what are those things? Every scholar, like, I'm a philosopher and I have a PhD in philosophy of religion, which means there are certain topics, if I see them, I just feel obligated to say something. Yeah. Like, as a church historian, what are those things where you're just like, oh, give me 2 hours?
Yeah. Well, one of those, as we've hit on before, the difference between world Christian history and church history. So most people just assume that church history is the history of a bunch of Western people, Western men, essentially, who were either Catholic or Protestant. And my big thing is now Christianity has been diverse since the very beginning, and we have Christians in China, we have Christians in India, we have Christians in Central Africa at a really early time period. So let's not just correlate all of church history with Western Christianity. So that's one of my big ones. Another big one, which is kind of related, so I also teach world religions, and I wrote a book a few years ago on Christianity and world religions. And the thing that really gets me is when I go to church or when I listen to sermons, hear people on Facebook say stuff, essentially they'll say, Jesus or Christianity is the only religion in which, God comes down to save people. That's just absolutely false. If you just learned about other religions, you'd realize there are plenty of other religions where God comes down to save people. So that's just one that just drives me crazy. And I know it's not exactly related to church history, but it's religious history that it kind of gets me. And I think, oh my goodness, how many more times do I have to hear this? Just, read the Bhagavad Gita just once and kind of clear all that stuff up. But yeah, I could go on and on.
There's a certain ignorance of your neighbor that comes up, and we do have an obligation. Avoiding slander and false testimony would probably mean that you've looked at the sacred text of someone you're talking crap about. I don't know. Or, hung out with one. It's interesting. I have a number of Muslim friends, had Muslim professors, and they're not in the same religion that most of my friends from the South who have very public ignoramus opinions about Islam post about. And you're like, okay, so, like the whole slandering, Jesus wasn't like, this is loving your neighbor probably means having talked to them, not about them. So those are totally there. And in the book, you have two different chapters that connect with Islam. One over just what is Islam, but also one over the kind of crusades and things. So it's like the one thing my Fox News elderly family members know about Islam is that they used to kill people trying to steal Jerusalem from Jews and Christians, and now they're doing it again. And you're like, oh, stab my face. But when you're introducing the church's relationship with Islam in a history class, what are like those things you want to make sure everyone leaves with so that they can just correct basic ugliness that comes out of too many mouths in the church?
Yeah, and you're right. Islam is in the news. It's not going to go away anytime soon. And that's why in the book I had 2 chapters that we had to. And I have 20 chapters. It was like we have to have 2 chapters on Islam. It's just too important. Mm-hmm. And so the way I teach world Christian history is the way it used to be taught essentially is you kind of divide up the early church and the 4th century is the dividing line, because that's when Constantine comes and he makes Christianity legal and everything else. Well, I extend that to the 600s, and I say early Christianity is essentially the beginning of Christianity until the emergence of Islam. That's how important Islam is. And I have a new book coming out next month with InterVarsity Press. It's called Introduction to World Christian History. And in that book and introduction, I make, maybe it's a provocative statement, but I say, listen, folks, at the end of the day, Muhammad is more important to Christianity than Constantine was. And what I'm trying to say is you can't teach or understand Christianity without understanding Islam, because it emerges as early, and Christianity and Islam are constantly going back and forth. And I look at them kind of like as Jacob and Esau. They're these brothers that are constantly from the same family line. They're constantly fighting with each other spiritually, physically, and so forth. But when it comes to things I want to correct, one of them is that I'd say Islam did not kill Christianity. It starved out Christianity. And so what I mean by that is when Islam emerges in the 600 and all the places that it goes, like in North Africa and the Middle East and Europe, Christianity was already there. Christianity was a dominant religion. But Muhammad himself and Arab Muslims did not go around to the Christians living in Syria or Egypt or Israel and say, with a sword to their throat, unless you convert, you're going to die. Mm-hmm. That's just simply not something that happened. So it was much more It was completely different from that. So it was a starving out of Christianity. So Christians were not immediately converted to Islam. They simply found it more beneficial to convert to Islam in the long run. So just kind of to tease that out is important for people to understand.
Yeah, and I think it's similar to kind of like if you are studying New Testament and early history, like there's a reason Marcion's horrible. And you can't be a Christian without knowing about Judaism, the transformation it has after the destruction of the Second Temple period in 70. Like the intertwining of all three monotheistic faiths is essential to the identity of all three.
Yeah.
And part of and I'd be interested in hearing why you think this is the case, but I've noticed that part of the problem is Christians having this kind of a myth about the purity or essence of Christianity, as if it did not emerge historically from somewhere and is continually re-understood historically. Like if you pay attention to the history of the church, half the questions on here don't make sense if the church didn't like think syncretistically with other faith traditions or philosophical positions. Like the idea that there's this pure essence of Christianity somewhere is just hard to hold up. And yet so many people have it that then our relationship with Judaism, Islam, let alone Confucianism, which you bring up, is something we can even begin to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hate to keep plugging my books, but I have another book coming out. The tentative series title is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, A Candid History of Christianity. And so I just wrote the first volume, which is early Christianity, and I don't have a release date yet. But the whole point is I'm saying, listen, we've got to stop with this naive, silly idea that Christianity was given to us in perfect form and that we never made any mistakes and everything has just been rosy and wonderful in the very beginning. And then there was this giant parentheses for, however many centuries you want to say until your tradition came along and you continued that perfect tradition that started in the very beginning. So from the very beginning, Christianity has been completely diverse. And so as I mentioned with Paul and the author of the book of James, so they're reading the same Bible, but they're coming to totally different conclusions. And so early Christianity, as opposed to just being this block of truth that's been given to us and it's been carried over faithfully or unfaithfully, depending on your tradition, like, no, it's different groups. And they're all in a certain way faithfully representing the tradition. And also they have ways they can be criticized and critiqued, but they're asking different questions. They're coming from different traditions, but they can all still be faithful traditions, even though they're very different.
Mm-hmm. When you think of Christianity outside of just kind of the Western experience, there are more today and in the past, there are more expressions of multi-faith Christians, people who practice say, like African traditional religion and Christianity, or like the same happens in Asia. Australia has some interesting multi-faith practices with Aboriginal Christians. I have friends that are missionaries in different places that are always wrestling with, like, can you be in multiple faiths? Is that like a rejection of one? Is it a perverting of both? And that's how we ask those questions, right? As Westerners who, like, religious diversity for me growing up was Free Will Baptist or Southern Baptist. So as taking the big view or historically, how does looking at it globally and historically change the interaction of faiths for people that would identify as Christian, but also keep practices and beliefs or patterns from other cultures, other faiths?
Yeah, well, it's a funny story. A couple of weeks ago, I took one of my classes. It was a world religions class. I took them to a Buddhist temple. And as we were sitting there, there was someone who was kind of officiating over it. And then he led us in chants and do all kinds of things. And afterward, we were talking to him and he said, "Oh, I'm a member at the Presbyterian church down the street." And it's like, oh my goodness. So he's a member at a Presbyterian church, but he's also a member at this Buddhist temple. And in fact is a leader in the Buddhist temple. And so you would think, like, how can you do that? Don't they seem like they're religious views that are incompatible? But he doesn't think that way, and that's a new question for us to enter, is that Christians are a little bit more okay with people who have diverse religious traditions. In the past, that wouldn't have been the case. So, looking at church history or the history of Christian missions, boy, we just have to openly confess we've done a really poor job because we fail to think missiologically about these types of questions. So missiologically, you're always starting with the question and you're using the materials that are there instead of kind of importing something from afar. So it's like, this is the reality. I'm going to start with this question. And you mentioned earlier Africa. And just think of when Western European missionaries go into Africa and they encounter a form of Christianity that's very different from their own. And the only response they really have is, we have to exterminate this because it's different from our own. So, we just have to confess we've made a lot of mistakes. At the same time, there are also some really successful ventures. So someone like the Jesuits, a Catholic group, I think of Matteo Ricci when he goes to China. There's a lot of these guys who go in and they're really sophisticated missionaries. When they go into China, they're not saying we got to exterminate all the different forms of Christianity. No, let's engage it. And actually we can learn from it and see their traditions are different from ours, but we have a lot to learn.
Well, how do you understand the relationship between the church to empire and then its, kind of totalitarian relationship with truth or epistemology?
Yeah, I lead my students on an exercise basically in early Christianity. I say, let's talk about some of the positive things when the church and state are aligned, and then let's talk about some of the negative features. And then I want you to keep however you answer that, keep that in the back of your head as we go through these different world Christian history classes. And I think by the time we get to the end of the class, maybe it's because more of me, but I feel like people get to the end of the class and they think, whoa, we got some serious issues when we have the church aligned with the state. And so I'm coming from probably a little bit more of an Anabaptist position on that regard, and saying that the church has made some of its worst decisions, I think, when it has become indistinguishable from the empire that it's in, or the state that it happens to be a part of. So as much distinction as is possible between the religious authority or the church authority structures and the political structures, I think is probably a healthier thing.
Mm-hmm. So how many times has the church asked the question, are these the end times?
Since the beginning, every century, every generation. So I had to plug that one in there. And you look at church history, there's always someone saying, it's the end. And then there's always someone else saying, are you nuts? That's not the end. Everything's fine. So that's what I hammer into my class and say, listen, from the beginning, and this is just part of being an American Christian, is there's just this, craziness about it's going to be the end at some point. And dispensationalism has been so influential in making us hyper aware of what the Bible says in relation to the end times. So it's something that all Christians of all generations have been talking about and having answers to, which happen to be wrong.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me in looking over just the questions themselves is how many times the church has wrestled with questions around bodies, be it the divinity of Jesus and his humanity, or holiness and the person, or who has authority over Christian bodies or newly Christianized people, or can priests marry? What do we do to mass death or discovered territory? Can Christians own slaves? Like, so many of the questions in church history have been about, what do we do with these bodies? None of them have been, did God really think it was this good when God made it and we should enjoy it? Like, that one hasn't come up yet. I was hoping the chapter 21 might have that one on there. But what do you make of all the different ways that the energy of the church has been around? Usually, how do other people use their bodies, or where should these bodies be, and what access should they have?
Yeah, well, it's like we have these things, they're bodies, and we can't get rid of them, and they're always with us. And the thing that I've learned from Orthodox Christianity is that...
You mean Eastern Orthodox?
Yeah, I mean Eastern Orthodox. That's right. Because, I mean, if you look in my book, I talk about there's a variety of Orthodox Christianities, but Eastern Orthodox Church is a tradition that I've learned a lot from over the years. And what they teach me, because I didn't get this in Protestant Christianity, is how important the body is, and that you can't have salvation without a body. You can't have any practices of the faith without the actual body. So I haven't thought about the way you did. That's interesting. You emphasized the body and how it's used and so forth. And I'm glad. I think that's important, because in the Protestant world, we tend to divorce, our bodies from our faith. And I think Christianity is always about our bodies. And we see that every aspect of our life, our bodies are involved. So I don't know
Well, even in the early church, the Gentile question is a body question.
Yeah.
Well, because I wonder, and if you pay attention to each one, that age was not going, we're now discussing whether or not we can give value to bodies of ourselves and others, then with the dignity God gave literally every human being, right? Which is the Eastern Orthodox they have a radical affirmation of the image of God.
That's right.
But each time it comes up and it's like this heated fight, and it's as if this is the one time we're going to have a really true fight. And I feel like that's kind of how the sexuality debate today gets framed with people on either side or whatever. But there's a lineage in the church for wrestling with these type of questions, and there's a history on different topics. I'm as a historian, do you see particular crises in the church as kind of parallel question points?
Oh, absolutely. And you've touched on some of those already. So the church is wrestling with all different types of questions related to the body. Racism is a topic that we as a church have not done a good job of addressing. And we see the results of that here in our culture today in America, as well as around the world. Same thing with our own sexuality, human sexuality. And so those are two major questions that the church should be wrestling with, and I think is wrestling with, but I don't think that we've done necessarily a good job collectively on what's the right way to frame these questions and what's the right way to respond to these questions. So those are two huge questions that are kind of lingering out there. And in the conclusion of the book, it's kind of saying, let me give you a little of what the 21st question would be. So the question for the 21st century. And I touch on those different things because, the 21st century, you can no longer ask just one overarching question. It's too diverse with 50,000 Protestant denominations. But in our culture in America, at least, we have to be asking questions about human sexuality and about race. So race and gender, to me, those are the big ones that the church has set us up on with its emphasis on bodies. So how can we use that and leverage it to make some better decisions than the church has done in the past?
And one of the other questions that kind of pops up, especially around both those issues, is the relationship of the church and asking it in a global church. So I'm in California, and in mainline Protestant churches pretty often, and most mainline Protestant leaders are more progressive around either issue, even if their congregations aren't the most racially diverse ones. They still think they're edgy or whatnot. But most of those denominations have a global correlate where there are bishops or elders in other parts of the world who do not see the ordination and baptism of gay, lesbian, transgendered people as the frontier of Christian embrace. Right. And the legislative power of the Western church imposing it on them, they experience as another form of Western oppression. And yet, if you talk to the lesbian bishop who is like, no, that's not, that's not what we want to do. So I feel like the fact that you tell the story as a global one means that even the questions that may be driving American Christianity around race or sexuality look real different the moment the church tries to talk to all of the church. Like once we take the body of Christ as being more diverse than just our city or our country.
Absolutely. And so you hit on those already, just thinking of the Episcopal / Anglican Church. In America, it's much more progressive than that in Africa. And so, as you know, what's this summer or recently the disciplining of African bishops, of Episcopal bishops, or the Episcopal Church in general. Same thing with Canterbury. So we see this issue of how Anglicans or Episcopalians in America deal with human sexuality in relation to how African Christians do, and we'll say sub-Saharan Africa, of the same tradition. And they come to the question with very, very different responses. And this is the fascinating and the beautiful, as well as the very frustrating and difficult part of wrestling with world Christianity, is because how much emphasis do we give to the African Christians vis-a-vis the Western Christians? Like it's a compromise, and we have to give and take, especially when you're part of the same tradition. But which one of them is going to give, or how are they going to work it out? And boy, I don't know. It's a messy, messy conversation.
So, how would you ask the question, how would global Christianity want to try to frame the question around just the environmental crisis? Because I feel like that is a place where, again, we should probably hang out with our Orthodox Christian friends who like to announce the resurrection to every part of creation before humans first at their Easter vigil. But what does that look like? Because like some questions are things take time, then they interact, or you have battle lines and it gets less heat. But there's not going to be less heat coming anytime soon when it goes to ecological crisis. And that's one place where, regardless of your theology on certain social issues, the ones bearing the burden are not the ones doing the problem. But the church is a place where, when we pray the Lord's Prayer and say, give us today our daily bread, we're praying it with people who can no longer grow food because of our carbon emissions as first world Christians. Or our trade policies, or our mechanizing and deterioration of their land. Like there are tons of ways that we're connected if we think globally, through our economy and the ecology crisis, that we need to think as a global church and not just argue about kind of identity politic issues, even though I couldn't not have an opinion that I hold passionately about it, and yet I think we could all agree pillaging the poor and planet is something Jesus was against, and there's no ambiguity. No hermeneutics necessary on this one. Yeah.
One of the things that I've lamented over the years, I went to seminary, and, we always think about the things I didn't learn in seminary. But one of the things that I feel like I didn't get in seminary was how to handle the social sciences, how the social sciences should be incorporated into our theology. So just thinking of sociology and anthropology, archaeology, politics, it just goes on and on. But these disciplines are really helpful for us because, again, if we are part of a larger Protestant American culture, we have to recognize that we simply don't know how to deal with the resources around us, with land, with our spiritualized theology that's so focused on salvation, how that relates to when I look outside and I see the earth, and what my existence as an American does to people living on the other side of the planet. So I think this is a place where we need to incorporate more of the social sciences into our theologies and give us a more robust understanding. And at the same time, we need to shed some of our theology that's just frankly unhelpful, and I would agree with you, unbiblical. And that's difficult to do. And we have our traditions, we have our institutions that already exist, and they're at the top and not really wanting to give any ground to this issue. So it's a serious issue that we have to keep thinking about. But how can we integrate some of these things together, shed some of the bad theology over the years?
So you've mentioned like multiple books you're working on and you're teaching. So I know that some people listening who are ministers or professors, people that have multiple jobs, but they create content all the time. Like you got to have some writing / productivity patterns that lead you able to publish that much, teach, and still be a human being.
Yeah. So what are my secrets, or what is
Yeah. What's the patterns or secrets or tips or whatnot, so that you have the time to be able to, not just manage everything, which a minister or a professor, and you get to be on really sweet committees, which are just like, and ATS keeps giving us new stuff to do. It's amazing. Like, where you aren't just in manager mode, but you're also in making mode. When you're doing that and having a life, what are some ways, patterns, tips, and such?
Yeah, well, I hopefully I do have a life. I have a wonderful wife and been married for 15 years and 3 kids that are fantastic, that are close in age together. You know what? When I'm at work, I work, and I try to limit distractions. And I think we live in a world where it's just so easy to get distracted. But when I have committee meetings, when I have other meetings, when I'm, on business-related things, I'm there and I want to be fully present. But when I have the time that I try to block out in my office to do work or to do research, do writing, whatever it is, I try to stay focused on that. And I think it's just a matter of, for me, it's a matter of staying disciplined. And also, I had a good friend over the years who kind of looked at my life, and if you fall into that, like Ephesians 4, the APES, the apostles, prophets, evangelists, teachers, and shepherds, and he kind of saw in me, said, what, you're really an apostle in a lot of ways. You're always generating new ideas and wanting to put them into play. And so he's kind of helped me kind of realize that part of myself and to always be generating new ideas. So how do I go about constantly thinking about what are some new ideas, and then how can I put those into practice? So I think with that aspect, I don't know if you're an Enneagram follower or a Myers-Briggs guy, but mine. Oh yeah, mine. I don't know if you can guess what mine are, but mine align pretty well with being a disciplined academic. So I hate to use like the nurture or the nature nurture issue and say kind of nature. I'm just kind of inclined to be able to to fit into that paradigm.
But let's see, INTP.
Close. I'm an INTJ.
Okay.
But in my teaching, I probably come across more as a P. But I'm a definite J on the Myers-Briggs. I happen to be 5 on the Enneagram. So I'm in love with ideas, and that's what gets me excited. Is just always having a new idea and kind of running forward with it. So it kind of helps.
So when you take up a research topic or a question, or you're digging into like a new text, how do you begin it? Like I know some people are the speed read all the way through. Some people are read the beginning slow, decide if you want to read the rest. Other what's the? I had a friend. He only reads for what he's writing, and so he's never read complete books except his qualifying exams. But no one knows it because he publishes all the time.
Yeah.
Once you've learned to learn, you don't need to read everything. You just need to read what you need to learn to read. And then after you've wrote something on it, you'll remember it again later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I had an epiphany a few years ago, and it was this. I am in control of everything that I read. And so when I read, I'm in the driver's seat. And I know that there's a book or an article, whatever it is I happen to be reading, you would think they're the ones who are in the driver's seat. No, I'm the one dictating what I'm going to read, how I'm going to read it, and what I'm going to get out of it. So I use that mentality when I do research. I just shift over, I turn on a light switch, and I say, I'm in control of all of this information. It keeps me really focused on what I need to learn. And, I learned this in PhD studies you never really fully read a book word by word. You have to be smart about how you do things. So you learn what is the most important thing about that book, and just kind of, I'm a high end, so I kind of intuit. I have an intuition on exactly what I need to be focusing on, and so I go with it. And then also for my research, I go in, I kind of know this is what I need to read, and I don't get hung up in all the details. I take the big picture of it. But at the same time, it's really important. And what your friend said, like me, I think of I get my information and I store it in a cabinet and in a file. I basically, when I read a book, I put that information in a folder, in a mental folder, and I put it in a mental cabinet. And then when I need to come back to it, I identify which cabinet, and then I identify the folder, and I pull it out again, and it's in my mind again. But I do that at the same time. It's really important to read outside of your field, because that's where a lot of the ideas are generated. It's not necessarily in your field. It's when I'm reading on something totally unrelated to my field that I get these great ideas, and then I say, okay, now I'm going to jump into my field and see what I can do with it.
Mm-hmm. So what have been kind of the recent discoveries that got your apostolic mind a popping?
Well, there's a book by Jared Diamond. It's now several years old. And, he's written several books. One's called The Third Chimpanzee, and the other one's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Mm-hmm. And I love the book Guns, Germs, and Steel because, he's looking at history and looking at, the past 15,000 years or so since the last ice age and trying to figure out how was it that these people tended to dominate the world and the other people did not. And so that's like a really provocative question. And to me, I've been pulling from that and thinking of church history. The next projects I want to work on is thinking I should no longer just be kind of teaching church history. I should be able to guess what church history is, and I should be able to predict what's going to happen based on climate, based on where people live, based on which languages they speak, what they're exposed to, what their theological tradition is, what are their outside threats. And based on those different factors, I should be able to predict what Christianity is going to do in all of those different contexts. So again, it's like sitting in the driver's seat. When I think of church history, I need to be in the driver's seat of not just explaining, what happened, but why it happened and what it's going to happen in the future. Like I can predict it now, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm not a 5, but I have friends with ones, and they tend to function that way. One of the things that I think historians get that other disciplines don't get is it's to be intellectual friends with people you have nothing in common with. Mm-hmm. So if you do philosophy of religion, after a while, you only read philosophers of religion who have decided on 3 or 4 questions in ways you do. And then you write things that only 50 people in the globe would understand with all those footnotes. Yeah. And so for me, one of the things has been, well, would it be like to intentionally remain open as a scholar? So I read a different intro to New Testament, Hebrew Bible, church history every year, or I get audio class versions of it. And the same for different philosophy classes in hopes that that I wouldn't be the world's most narrow scholar, though I could enjoy an eternity of connecting Whitehead and 19th century German idealism in articles. That would just I wouldn't be sad. But I do think part of it is connected to that vocation and the way you were describing, like your friend was like, no, you need to be in charge. You need to own your voice. You need to recognize that you're making decisions. And even outside of being a professor or a minister or something like that, the way you describe it really does highlight an understanding of Christian vocation in a world where you have way more options than Christians had at any other point in church history. Yeah. Right? Like, how many more options do most American Christians have than any other point in church history? During the medieval period, you had a vocation that was very clear and set. Like, you might have had 3 options if you're Martin Luther, or So how do you kind of describe this self-understanding and vocation as a professor, but also sharing it with students who could have a whole host of different an MDiv is like a degree where you could have 1 million jobs after it. So who knows where they're going?
Yeah, absolutely. And I am trying to be a good steward of church history. And to me, church history allows us to ask big questions and to not necessarily have the answers that we would expect to have. And so I always tell my students, in church history classes, if you walk away with nothing else, I want you to at least find one or two dialogue partners for the rest of your life. And so for you, it could be Whitehead or something. And for me, I like Tertullian in the early church. It's like he's just endlessly fascinating. He's grumpy. He's opinionated. He's provocative. He's very smart. So I would say, listen.
He changes directions.
He changes directions.
Prophets. Come on.
He's wonderful. I kind of describe him as the early Martin Luther. So Martin Luther is wonderful in so many ways. He's horrible in other ways, but he's just one of these people that I say you can dialogue with him for the rest of your life. He has that much to give you, and you can learn from him. So trying to teach my students, like, I recognize, most of you are not going to be professors, and it's not going to be your vocation to be in an office and to be researching and always learning, kind of generating new ideas for scholarship. But at the same time, it is part of your job to always be thinking and to always be engaging your context, to always be asking thoughtful questions. And so how can you learn this in church history? Well, it's all there if you can just kind of take the time. Basically, I use church history classes as a way to say, I know you're not going to remember most of this stuff, but if I can at least expose you to some things that are going to be really helpful for you in the long run and you can kind of engage them, that's essentially what I'm trying to do in those classes. And so the resources, the people that they find are going to be helpful to them no matter what career they choose, no matter what vocation. They're lifelong partners that they can learn from.
Mm-hmm. So one more question, and this is kind of connected to you talking about looking at history and then looking towards the future. One of the shifts that's happened in church history multiple times is a shift where the energy in the church moves from really some type of teaching office, a teaching-centric type of church, to then one that's more service-centric, be it like the monastic movement into the Reformation or something like that. And I feel like part of our current situation is these identity crisis and very teaching-centric, thousands of varieties of post-Reformation expressions going on and on and on. And yet there's tons of energy being built around communities where those dividing lines and identity markers aren't that interesting, where the community is built more on service than teaching. And that recognizing that, it to me is the perfect reason to have a whole host of ecclesiological entrepreneurs or something like that, where you just recognize that the teaching role or that kind of role is actually being more dispersed. So like when 30,000 people hang out with this conversation and download it and listen to it, those people had a longer church history talk than most of the rest of the church that week in the United States. And these people do it every week. And that's one way of doing like the teaching and learning part. And yet I know tons of the listeners who are parts of these small Christian alternative communities that may not preach every week, but serve their community or whatnot. So anyway, that was a really vague statement followed by a question mark that no one hears.
No, I got it. I heard the question mark. So I'll use this as a time to come back to the Enneagram. So something I'm excited about working on is thinking, how can I use the Enneagram to understand and to explain church history? And I've been doing that. I started with John Wesley. So I've been writing some blogs on freshexpressions.org, I think. And so I just had a new one come out today. But it's like looking at John Wesley as a number one. To me, he is a perfect example of a number one on the Enneagram, which I kind of classify as a principled perfectionist. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I've kind of discerned that the whole pietist tradition is actually a one on the Enneagram. So the pietists are really the ones. And then another way to think of it is like all of the fundamentalists, they're eights on the Enneagram. And I was just reading a recent biography of a fundamentalist, and I was just thinking, this guy is an eight. It's so clear. And it's like if you look at the whole fundamentalist tradition, they're eights. And then if you look at the theologian tradition, they tend to be more fives or something like that. So in other words, like hitting on your question there, it's kind of like, if you use the Enneagram to understand people in the past, you can see how the different traditions come alive. So, Mother Teresa may be probably a number 2 on the Enneagram or something like that. So you see these wonderful traditions. Richard Foster has a book on the different streams. I think he has 6. But to me, I'd want to update it to there's really 9 streams in the Christian tradition if you use the Enneagram. And you can see really clearly how you've got the 9 peacemakers, how they're kind of doing their own thing, and they give us some wonderful things. And then you've got the 2s over here in their tradition giving us this, and then so forth and so on. So I like to look at it, as I say to my students, church history is a gold mine. It's a treasure trove. And it's because you can see all these different personalities at work. They don't necessarily get along, but all the streams are there, and you can really learn from what they have to say to us.
Yeah, and I think it gives you a certain type of humility to go the Reformation eventually happened, but there were a bunch of people that had ideas like it, tried and failed, and then eventually something sticks, and but tons of people are faithful all the way up to it.
Yeah,
and I think that there's we're at another point where people just need to figure out how to be faithful and creative in a whole bunch of different ways. And we don't have to sit around on the internet and give every possible new instantiation crap just because our new version's the coolest. We recognize at some point in the next 50, 100 years, there'll be a whole new expression of the church that connects different dots and reformulates all the different little outposts of creativity that are going on now. I'm halfway through the Brand Luther book.
Okay.
Oh, it's awesome. I mean, technology connected to branding, marketing, and actually well done research on Luther is just a fun book to read. Yeah. And in it, the Andrew Pettigrew, something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
He was a Reformation scholar and then did the history of publishing and books for a long time, and then did this book for the anniversary next year of the Reformation. In it, he ends up looking at how the size of text of Luther's writings, to how they branded it, the relationship between him and his 3 best friends or 3 biggest partners led to this community. And you could Enneagram those 4 people, and it's very clear who's playing what role, and why they worked well as a team and stuff. So at one point you think, oh, is this going to be Jesus the CEO? Instead, it's this story about how all these weird things start going on and lining up at the same time. So the most weird collection of friends get stuck in Wittenberg with a crotchety printer who won't do anything different until he kind of has to. Yeah. And then there's this huge explosion. And but when you read it, it's this people are just trying to be faithful to what was in front of them, and it changed the world, as opposed to, this here I stand off of the mountain and Charlton Heston is playing, that kind of image of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. I haven't read the book, but I look forward to checking it out. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, you have these complex personalities at work. And I think, as mentioning the social sciences, psychology can really help us understanding some of these people better, because it's, at the end of the day, they're just people, and they have their own personalities, and God works through them, but by means of their really strange, quirky personalities,
Mm-hmm. Oh man, human beings, we're something. But, we'll any final thoughts, questions, comments? You should just email me a link to all of the books that are published or are going to be, because you mentioned them all, and where you're blogging and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Be happy to. And I mean, my final words would just be again, church history is a minister's, a pastor's, a professor's best friend, because it's all there. And there's so much that can be learned from it. And I recognize, we've not done a good job as history professors kind of teaching, but it's all there. And if people can kind of be patient and take their time to work through stuff, they're going to find some wonderful resources. So maybe my book could be a good start for people. I'm trying to make it user-friendly. So I'm always thinking church history is a gold mine. How can I make it more user-friendly to people, just to the average person? And so that's why I thought, what if I just have 20 questions, 1 question per century? I have a few different responses. I don't even necessarily come to a conclusion, but just kind of organize it that way. So if that's someone's entrance into church history, may it be, and I hope they enjoy it, and that would spark them on to kind of explore other aspects of church history.
All righty. Well, thank you very much for hanging out.
Thank you.
This podcast is sponsored by Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a theological school that offers Christian education in service of intelligent, just, and compassionate religious and civic communities. They welcome students to a safe space for truth-seeking conversation about the Bible, Jesus, and faithful living. They have on-campus and distance learning options. Go check them out at www.wherefaithleads.com.